Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Erin Cameron and I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar, SACE Introduction to TVA Integrated Resource Planning Process. On behalf of SACE, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Your interest and support make our work possible. Today's webinar is a great opportunity to share, learn, participate, ask questions, and get involved. We have quite a number of folks on the line today, so to ensure decent sound quality, we have muted all of your lines, but please feel free to type in any questions you have throughout the presentation using the questions option on your control panel. We will then answer the questions at the end of the presentation. For those of you not familiar with SACE, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I would like to acknowledge all of our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. You can do so by visiting our website, www.cleanenergy.org. And now to get us started today, I'll hand it over to SACE Executive Director, Stephen Smith. Steve?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everybody for joining. I'm just going to make some very brief opening comments and then turn it over to Jimmy and Angela. First of all, thank you, and this is a new year, and with TVA's Integrated Resource Plan 2014 is going to be a very important year. This is the third public integrated resource plan that TVA has done. They did one back in the mid-1990s, and then they took about a 15-year hiatus, and then they did one in the 2010-2011 timeframe. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And at that point, they agreed that they would not go longer than 5 years between refreshing their planning process. And we welcomed that. 15 years was too long. Neighboring utilities usually do integrated resource planning processes about every year or every 3 years, depending on their regulatory oversight. The IRP is very, very important for the Tennessee Valley Authority, as it is for all utilities, because it is where they really take a long view look at what they need to meet demand and also to level the playing field, should be leveling the playing field between supply and demand and looking for low cost, low risk options. We felt that TVA did a really good job in the last integrated resource plan in involving public input, and we look forward to that happening again. You'll learn more about that today. We also believe that this is a rare opportunity to gain insights into TVA. TVA is not regulated like other large utilities in the United States. Their board of directors, which are appointed by the president, serve not only as the board, but they also serve as a regulator, and that's a unique configuration that we see nowhere else. And so the Integrated Resource Plan is a rare opportunity for members of the public to gain insight into what TVA's thinking is and also influence the outcomes. So we encourage you to pay attention to what we're going to share today and get involved, and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy stands ready to find lots of mechanisms to serve both as a conduit for your information that as the process develops, but then also as a way to help influence the outcome of the process so we have a cleaner world that is more responsive to the challenges of how we produce and consume energy. So with that, let me turn it over to Jimmy Greene, and he'll lead you through the discussion.
All right, thanks, Steve. And thanks to everybody who's on the webinar here. I hope this is going to be a really productive session. I'm Jimmy Greene. I am the Energy Policy Manager here at SACE, and I'll be actively involved in this IRP process. So I hope you'll all think of me as your partner in this process. I'll put my contact info up on one of the later slides, so please do get in touch. And while we're on the subject and while we're on this slide, let me encourage you to visit the cleanenergy.org website. I mean, not now. You know, you should be paying close attention to every word that Angela and I are saying right now. But after the webinar, visit the webpage, read the blog, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Do all these things, and let the NSA know that you support SACE, okay? Now, before we get started, let me say that this webinar is about the Tennessee Valley Authority's Integrated Resource Planning Process. And I'm sure most of you know who TVA is. I think maybe some of you are actually from TVA, but just in case, let me give you a quick rundown. TVA is a public power corporation owned by the U.S. government. In other words, it's owned by us, by you and me. TVA generates electricity and sells it to 155 local power companies. Those are the people you guys are sending your bills to every month. So we're not customers of TVA directly, but TVA is a public power corporation. That means it belongs to us, so we should have some say in how TVA operates. Now, fortunately, this IRP process provides a great opportunity for us to have some say in how TVA operates. In fact, TVA is asking for our help. So I hope SACE and I hope that I can serve as a channel to help all our voices be heard by TVA. So let's get started here. This page is the presentation overview. This is what we're going to be talking about today. And because of the number of folks participating, rather than pause for questions during the presentation, we're going to save them all up for the end. Also, let me say this. These slides will be available on our website after the webinar. So there's going to be a few slides in here that I've included for completeness and to illustrate a point or something like that. And I might not be addressing all the points on every slide, but they will be available after the webinar. And if you have any specific questions, please feel free to ask. So the first thing we're going to be talking about, what is an integrated resource plan? And again, there's a lot of people on this, and some of you might know what an IRP is, some might not. I'll go over briefly, just a few general points on what an integrated resource plan is. We'll talk a little bit about TVA's 2011 IRP and what they did, what came out of it, and how that's progressed since then. We'll go over a little bit about why TVA is doing another IRP now. We'll talk about what to expect in the upcoming IRP and discuss the timeline for the IRP. Excuse me. And the most important thing is this last point, how you can get involved in the IRP process. So first, let's talk about what is an integrated resource plan. This is a quote from a RAP document that sort of projects the general thinking in the field about what an IRP is. It's a plan for meeting forecasted annual peak and demand plus reserve margin through a combination of supply side and demand side resources over a specified future period. The way TVA looks at it is the integrated resource plan will serve as a roadmap to guide TVA to a low-cost, low-risk mix of generation sources and demand-side options. Now, I want to point out this roadmap analogy here. That's actually fairly relevant here. It's not a detailed plan. It's not a blueprint. It's a roadmap. In other words, what we want to make sure is that we've got the roadmap for Tennessee and not for France, okay? And we want to make sure that we know we're heading to Memphis, I guess, or not Paris, France, okay? But once we know that, we can use the roadmap to figure out how to get from here to there. There might be some delays along the way. There might be some detours, some blockages, but once we've got the map, we'll know how to get to where we want to go. This is a slide from TVA about what their view of resource planning is. It's about solving puzzles. And basically, they're asking a lot of questions and trying to put together a portfolio of options that meets their desired outcomes. Now, if you look at the little men on the left there, you see one of the things they're talking about is portfolio optimization. And if any of you have ever tried to put together a stock portfolio, you know that the purpose of portfolio optimization is not to wring every possible, dollar out of your portfolio. What you're trying to do is, with a diversified portfolio, you're trying to make sure that if the economy tanks, you don't lose everything. So in this case, what the purpose of this resource planning exercise is not to wring every possible dollar out of the process, but to make sure that in any reasonably foreseeable future scenario, TVA can still turn the lights on and without raising rates through the roof. So try to think of it that way. We're not necessarily optimizing things, but just trying to make sure that things stay workable in any possible future scenario. Maybe not any possible, but any reasonably probable future scenario. So this is basically a pretty simple flow chart of how this process works. Right now, they've already gone through the initial scoping study. Right now, TVA is working on putting together inputs and frameworks. Then there'll be the modeling, analyzing, and evaluating phase. Then they're going to issue a draft IRP and a call for public comments. Then they'll go back and reevaluate that and then make the final recommendation to the TVA board. This points out 3 public input and comment periods. Like I said, the scoping comment period has already passed. The next specific comment period will be at the time of the draft IRP. Right now, we're going through an ongoing process where they're looking for public input, although there's not a really well-defined process for the public to provide input at this point. That's why we want you to keep SACE in mind as your channel to that process. So now let's talk about TVA's what they did in 2011. TVA looked at a wide range of scenarios, and they came out with a number of recommendations. These are the recommendations. I'm not going to go over all of them, but especially the energy efficiency, demand response, renewables, and coal capacity idle. I'd like to talk about the EEDR. They set some goals, and they did a pretty good job of reaching those goals, but there were some problems along the way. They shut down some programs, and we're hoping that in the 2015 process we can avoid that. Similarly, in the renewable side, they did look at a lot of cost-effective renewable energy sources. Then they shut their program down in April, so we're hoping they can avoid that. The one thing we are real happy about is the coal capacity idle. They went a pretty good bit beyond what they had planned in the 2011 IRP in that regard. This slide shows, excuse me, the components of the IRP recommendations and what they did. And, you know, you can look through those, but if you notice from the red check marks on the side, you'll see they did follow through with most of what they had planned to some extent, maybe not as aggressively as we would have liked. The energy storage, you know, is kind of an outlier. That's not really a priority right now. The Raccoon Mountain Pump Storage Facility had some problems, so we're going to give them a pass on that one. This slide shows the key wins and losses that we got out of the 2011 process from SACE's perspective. I'm going to go through these a little bit. The energy efficiency demand response, we did get them to take a look at more energy efficiency in the process. They didn't really go as far as we would have liked. They sort of picked some numbers and plugged those into the model. We're hoping in this round that we can convince them to allow the modeling to come up with the best level of energy efficiency and demand response and use that in the portfolio planning process. The renewables were evaluated at the time. To begin with, it was part of the thought was there was going to be a federal RPS. When that went away, some of this renewable energy examination faded off. The coal capacity idled, we got them to look at a fairly aggressive coal idling number, and they actually kind of went beyond that. Energy storage, again, not so much. The nuclear additions, in the 2011 plan, the Bellefonte and Watts Bar 2 plants were in the plan, and there was also some, you know, future nuclear additions, you know, a reactor to be named later that were in the plan. We're hoping that there's been enough change in the situation that some of those assumptions will be left out of the 2015 process. Natural gas, I guess you're probably mostly aware that this breakthrough in fracking has led to very much of an increased supply of natural gas, which has led to a reduction in cost of natural gas, which has made a lot of these other alternatives look less cost effective, which is one of the reasons we're getting so many, a lot of an aggressive coal retirement scheme going. And again, plans and actions, here's what they had planned, and the energy efficiency and demand response, again, early ramp up occurred, then budget constraints kicked in, and we're hoping that in this process, the amount of energy efficiency will be determined through the process and not through the budgeting process, but we'll see how that goes. Wind investments have picked up. Coal idling has been pretty aggressive. Energy storage, again, not an issue. Right now, the Bellefonte development looks like it's been deferred. We're hoping that continues as is. The transmission issue was not really addressed in the 2011 IRP, but it's become a bigger focus, especially with the number of coal plants that have been retired. Balancing the transmission system at TVA has become an issue, and we're hoping that that will be included in the 2015 process. So let me address why TVA is doing an IRP now. As Steve said, they went through this process and they've found that a few things have changed that make it seems like a good idea to redo their IRP now instead of in another year or two. There's four things mainly. One, again, as I mentioned, the increase in supplies of natural gas. The decline in electricity demand growth is a fairly big thing. TVA was projecting, well, I guess 3 to 4% a year demand growth. Now it's at less than 1%. So that's been a huge change in the outlook for the future that TVA is addressing. The delays in completing Watts Bar 2 are a factor. At the time of the 2011 IRP, Watts Bar was on schedule. It's since been delayed, and that's going to have some impact on the resources available for the IRP process, and also the coal plant retirements, which again flow out of the first item there, the increased supplies and lowered costs of natural gas. Also, new environmental regulations that are coming out make it look like a good idea to step up the coal plant retirements. This is basically what I just said in a little more detail. Let me point out the HVDC transmission thing here. That's something we're working on. There's 2 projects on track to bring electricity into the TVA territory. That's going to play a fairly big factor in the upcoming IRP process, so we want to keep an eye on that. And generally, this last item, TVA has used the analogy of being on the highway. They like to say, they're on a 6-lane highway, and they try to keep to the middle, but the way the world has turned out, they're sort of off to the side. We would say they're actually kind of off the highway and really need to make some changes to get back on. So now let's talk about the 2015 IRP planning process. They've started out by addressing a number of critical uncertainties. The first of these, as we mentioned, the sales. The TVA sales have been flat or possibly even declining in the last couple of years, and they're not projected to grow as aggressively as they had in the past. This is going to make for a whole new planning environment for TVA, and this is going to be one of the main things that I think TVA is going to have to address in their business plan, is how they're going to address a low or no growth future. So that'll play a big part in the 2015 IRP planning process. The other thing, the natural gas prices have dropped quite a bit since 2011. They have a history of being fairly highly variable. Natural gas prices tend to swing a lot, but the fracking that's a new technology that seems to have brought the prices down for a while. They'll probably go up a little bit, but it's not clear how much, so that's a major uncertainty. Electric prices at the TVA boundary, these are the sales that TVA is, the electricity that TVA is buying to provide to their customers. Coal prices are an uncertainty. As I mentioned, the environmental regulations are coming out. There's been maybe today, I think, some rules about existing generation facilities, and within the next 6 or 8 months, there'll probably be some rules coming out about, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. What just came out was new facilities. There'll be some rules coming out that'll impact existing facilities. So we're all kind of waiting to see how that's going to work out. And along those lines, we're not sure what's going to be happening with the CO2 regulations. There might be some pricing, cap and trade kind of legislation. We're waiting to see about that. Another big issue is the penetration of distributed generation. This was pretty much a non-issue in 2011, but as solar prices and wind prices have been dropping just tremendously over the past few years, the penetration of both of those technologies has increased, and that's going to have a big impact on how TVA plans their generation resources. National energy efficiency adoption might be coming down the road, and the general economic outlook obviously is pretty is a major uncertainty. The economy has kind of been a little bit flat recently. We're hoping, but there are signs that it's going to be growing again, but it's impossible to tell how it's going to work out. So that's a major uncertainty. So TVA is looking at 9 scenarios in the IRP planning process. The scenario is a sort of a guess, I guess, at what the future is going to look like. Each of these 9 scenarios represents a possible future world that TVA has to be ready for. And they're in 5 major groups representing a declining economy, a growing economy, stringent environmental requirements, a changing paradigm. Everybody puts solar on the roof, or the existing coal becoming totally exploited. So what they're going to do is take those scenarios. I think they're going to narrow down to 5 scenarios that's going into their modeling process. So that's where we are right now in the 2015 IRP process. Another thing that's going along parallel is this supplemental environmental impact statement. I'm going to let Angela address that.
Hey everybody, my name is Angela Garoni. I'm the Southeast Energy Research Attorney here at SACE, and I just wanted to kind of explain this concurrent process that's happening with the IRP that happened as well in the 2011 process. So along with the IRP, TVA is undertaking an environmental impact assessment, and we'll be releasing drafts and a final of that along the same timeline as they are with the final and draft IRP. They're calling it a supplemental environmental impact statement in that it will build off of the 2011 EIS that was prepared during that IRP review process. And the things that TVA has indicated during their public scoping meetings, they will be analyzing along with the IRP are air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, water resources, fuel consumption, solid waste, land requirements, and social and economic impacts. So this is an important avenue for those of us concerned with the environmental impacts of various types of generation resources to get on the record in front of TVA their concerns. And so SACE will definitely be weighing in on the draft when that comes available. And so please reach out to Jimmy. He's our main point of contact here for most of the IRP stuff, but I will be working more heavily on the comments, and therefore might be some opportunities for collaboration or for us to voice similar concerns through our comments if perhaps your group doesn't have the bandwidth to create your own. And these timelines are parallel, and so we'll talk more about the timeline and phases of the IRP when we talk about how you can get involved in the process. So I think I'll pass it. Oh, that's right. Never mind. We're here. Here's the timeline. So we're going to the section for the timeline of the process. So this is another slide from TVA that they've put out. So you'll see where we are now. So we're finished with the public scoping, and they're moving into actually the working groups that are involved with the TVA IRP process or have begun and are still continuing to meet. And if we go to the next slide, it should, here's another TVA that kind of makes it a little clearer to see. So you'll see that there are brackets pretty much to signify when the public engagement period is open, but there are actually only two what we would call formal public input processes for the TVA IRP, and those are highlighted with the double asterisk. So you'll see the scoping comments that we mentioned. You'll get, then when they present, TVA will present initial results in the fall of 2014 will be the opportunity to provide formal comments on the draft IRP that comes out at that point, and then there will also be an opportunity at the end to weigh in once the final draft of the IRP has been released. So this slide lays out a little more clearly where we see the key opportunities to get involved are as we move on through this process into 2014 and 2015. So a couple advices outside of the public input formal avenues that I've already outlaid is that there are several working groups and a new federal advisory committee that has been created that will be very heavily involved in the IRP process. I'll kind of explain those more in the next slide. But SACE and other of our allies have seats on some, if not all, of those working groups, the TVA working groups involved in this process. So to reiterate what Jimmy said at the beginning, that's why we would really like to be a channel for those who do not have seats on these boards to be able, or in these groups, to be able to get our concerns in front of them through these avenues, as well as the more formal public input. And then the second bullet here is to highlight what we see as the most important opportunity for input, which would be the response to the initial results. So once TVA has done a lot of their modeling and analysis and completed a decent amount of these working group meetings, they'll put out their initial results. And this is the opportunity for technical in the fall of 2014, and that will be the opportunity for more technical expertise and more specific opportunities for high-level, or I'm sorry to say more specific opportunities for involvement once we see what TVA says. It's not really clear right now what that exact process is, but we will, SACE will continue to update stakeholders and those of you on the call on how that begins to develop and how we can help you all become involved as we go through this process with TVA. And lastly, I mentioned that there was the opportunity for formal comments after the final draft of the IRP, and this usually isn't the place where you'll see a lot of changes, TVA really responding to a lot of these comments because they've pretty much come to the finalization of the IRP, but it is an important moment to get on record comments that you think are important and can be used to leverage towards the next IRP process and potentially creating leverage around specific resource asset decisions, because as Jimmy said, this isn't a blueprint, it's more of a roadmap, so there won't be necessarily a lot of specificity on particular resources plant by plant, but this is an opportunity in the final draft around the spring 2015 to get some of those comments on the record. And this is just another TVA slide featuring Steve up there on the top picture, the far right. And this, I really just wanted to highlight that TVA has indicated that there will be quarterly public briefings while the IRP goes on. It's not clear, I don't even think TVA is very clear on how that will work at this early stage, but once again, continue to check back with Jimmy as we figure out, I'm sure we'll be hearing from TVA when those are happening. I'll also note that TVA indicated at their public scoping meetings that they would be posting the presentations of the IRP working group online after those meetings have been conducted. So check back on the TVA website that we provided in here. That's kind of their home page for all the TVA IRP stuff. So here, I know we've already talked about these, but this kind of just lays it out a little clear on what the stakeholder groups are in TVA that they've created to help the public have a message and be able to get that in front of TVA and really work together. So I'll mention the first one, which is a little different than the rest, is a newly created Federal Advisory Committee Act committee. So these are actually created through a federal act. They are counsel to the TVA Board, and they have begun their meetings, their 2-year period, made up of various appointed, some by the governor, some industry, a lot of the different stakeholders, and then there are 2 groups, SACE as well as the Southern Environmental Law Center, that have a seat on that committee. And so that committee actually is open for public input. They have a public comment period just like TVA meetings do. So that's actually the big difference between that body and the working groups that are laid out below, is that they have to answer to the FACA committee rules, and therefore have to have a public input process. So those are a little more open. You can attend those meetings, and you can look on the website. Actually, TVA allows you to ask questions directly to work members through their website. So I'd recommend checking that out. The last 3 groups are the ones that are specifically Integrated Resource Plan working groups. The first one I've mentioned is the aptly named Integrated Resource Plan Working Group, of which SACE is a member, as well as Sierra Club, and I believe SELC also have, as far as the environmental community, seats on that working group. These provide input and counsel into various work efforts and initiatives within TVA, but this Integrated Resource Plan is the larger body, and then there's the Energy Efficiency Information Exchange and the Renewable Information Exchange. Some of these have bodies. I believe the Renewable Information Exchange was in existence before, kind of separate from the IRP process, but now they've all been brought together, meeting separately but working towards the common goal of creating an IRP that has both public input and technical expertise in all of these, both energy efficiency, renewable information from the stakeholders, and that we could then bring it back to TVA. So as far as the process for how we see this going forward, we would again encourage to collaborate through SACE and other working group members to voice your concerns and what you would like them to speak to when they're involved in these meetings, because once again, there's no written comment process or no public avenue into those groups, although, as I said before, the presentations from the working group will be available on the TVA website after the fact. And these will mostly be meeting through through the spring of 2014. Renewable energy work is through TVA and their RIX, which is the Renewable Exchange Process. And then we believe that energy efficiency work is further along internally at TVA because the EE information exchange is a little more nascent than the TVA RIX process. So I think that's still kind of to be determined. And here is the link for everything IRP on TVA's website, which TVA has been very helpful in getting that website and having it be really the base so you don't have to be hunting around for this kind of stuff on their website. And then this is just, we wanted to lay out, who here at SACE is working outside of the kind of formal process that we've outlined in this slide. So as we said, Jimmy Greene is our really main point of contact. John Wilson is more of our technical studies analysis. He is on the IRP working group. And I will be serving, I work mostly on TVA coal plant issues, but track, a lot of the organizing efforts across the TVA service territory. So I know many of you I talk to on a regular basis, and so just continue to think of me as that kind of resource there. We have Simon Mahan, who works on our wind work around the TVA territory. Charlie Coggeshell is our solar staffer, and then Jimmy is also, outside of his just being IRP guy here at SACE, he's mostly involved in all of our energy efficiency stuff, so he will be your contact there. Sarah Barzak, many of you work with her on our nuclear issues, so she's been great about fielding those, so continue to use her as a conduit there. And then, of course, our fearless leader, Steve, is on the work and works very closely with TVA staff, so he is our TVA board liaison here at SACE. I think with that, I will kick it over to Jimmy to start our question and answer, as we'll see what we have here on the questions.
All right, thanks, Angela. That's about it. And I guess the one thing I want to repeat is that I hope this will be the first step in bringing us all together as a group so we can have a real impact on how TVA goes forward through the IRP process and how they provide electricity to those of us who live in the Tennessee Valley. So we're going to address your questions now. If you have any, remember, if you haven't already, type your questions into the box in your control panel, and we'll answer the ones we can. And if we don't get to your questions, we'll try to respond online once we post this webinar. And any questions we can't answer, we'll probably just ignore and blame it on a computer glitch. So what do we got?
And I'll also remind some of you, I see you've raised your hand. Because of how many people we have on this webinar, we're not really going to try to figure out how to unmute everybody and have a real person-to-person discussion. So if you have raised your hand, please submit that question through the chat box. I'll start off with one just to, it's rather easy, I think I can answer here, is does SACE consider natural gas from fracking clean energy? And to respond to that, I think it's a good question, but here at SACE, so we see natural gas as a cleaner resource than coal and nuclear energy. We support and continue to look for strong regulations around natural gas extraction. We remain concerned about leakage issues of methane associated with natural gas extraction. And we also believe, once we've figured out really the impact there, we do believe that natural gas can ramp better so as to work more easily with renewable energy implementation and the intermittency issues that can come from this increased distributed generation implementation. So I hope that answers, that was from Brian Brainerd. So Brian, I hope that answers your question. And if when we answer these questions, since we don't have the discussion process here, if you feel that you need to follow back up with us, just do not hesitate to reach out with us on that. We have a question from Shu-Sun Kwan. Could we access TVA's study method of EE/demand resource?
Well, in our experience, not directly. We, as I pointed out, SACE is participating in both the Integrated Resource Plan Working Group and in the Energy Efficiency Exchange. The modeling will be taking place in, those two venues, not taking place in those venues, but there is an access through those two venues. So I would suggest if you have any specific questions, just email me. My email was up on the staff contact page, and I will see what I can do to get that through.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here from Paul Messerschmidt. And the question is, does new generation include opportunities for IPPs, or is TVA a quote-unquote closed system?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking. The TVA is a closed system, has a monopoly in the area. So if you're asking about outside power contracts, there's a possibility to do that. If you're asking about inside generation, you would have to go through, inside the system generation, you'd have to go through the existing TVA processes, the RSO, and other things like that. And probably the best thing would be to contact TVA directly about that if that's where you're heading with that. If you have any more general questions, feel free to contact me.
Okay, thanks for the question. Here we have another question from Wolf Nagley. Will this IRP also cover TVA's economic development mandate, and will they also revise the TVA Natural Resources Plan as part of this? I think I can handle that question, Wolf. There is economic development is one of the things that they will be considering as part of the SEIS process. It's one of the social and economic impacts is one of those categories that they're going to look at through there. Strictly speaking, it's not for economic development. The IRP isn't really, that's not the purpose. It's more what Jimmy was talking about, to create this roadmap and ensure that they have enough power and resources to continue to provide low-cost power across the region, depending on what kind of futures or scenarios we have as we move forward in TVA. The Natural Resources Plan is a good question because I think it's still something I'm personally trying to get my head around, is how the different TVA guidance and policy documents dealing with environmental impacts and environmental policies interact with the IRP and the SEIS process. TVA has not only the Natural Resources Plan, they have a Climate Change Adaptation Plan that they submitted under an executive order. So there's a lot of different, they also have the Natural Resources Plan. So there's a lot of different, and I'm not quite sure, and this is a conversation we've had with TVA to an extent, and we'll continue to have to figure out how these work together to make sure that everything is working in collaboration across TVA's various documents while this IRP process goes on. Let's see. Here's a question from Will Hegman. Is there any focus of how TVA interactions with local power providers are being leveraged to apparently destabilize renewable energy development?
Yeah, I think that's the kind of question we're going to lose to a computer glitch. There is a lot of ongoing interaction between TVA and their local power providers. I'm not even going to touch whether they're trying to destabilize the process or not. There's a number of different ways you could look at it, but generally speaking, it is an interesting interaction that goes on between TVA, the local power companies, and TVPPA, which is the trade association of the local power companies, and probably way too much for me to go into right now, so I'm going to move on to the next question.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see, I think I'm trying to find new questions before we go. Some people have had double questions here. One question here is from Stephen Alexander. Is grid electrification part of the TVA IRP planning process?
I'm not sure what grid electrification is. Sorry.
All right, so Stephen,
if you're talking about smart grid applications, as I mentioned, in the 2011 IRP, transmission issues weren't really addressed. In the upcoming 2015 IRP, there's going to be more emphasis on transmission planning. So some of the smart grid applications will be involved in that, if that's what you mean.
Okay, yeah, and if you, Stephen, if you have further clarification, if we didn't quite catch what you were getting at, just feel free to reach back out. I wanted to bring up a comment here from, I'm not sure what just happened there. So Holmes Hummel brought up in response to the question earlier of how this interacts with the Natural Resources Plan, that Integrated Resource Plan is actually a response under PURPA. The TVA must follow. So PURPA, if you're not familiar, is a law specific to electric power generation. So IRP legally is nothing to do with natural resource management. I think as we continue to think about how resource planning affects the environment around us, we're going to work with TVA to make sure that although that's not actually in the IRP process, that they're not contradicting themselves across policy documents, and are doing the best they can to both ensure that they have enough resources to cover our electricity, but that they're also having minimal impact on the environment through use of those resources. So thanks, Holmes, for that input, made it a little more clear than I think I said it. Let's see if we have, here's a question from Brian. So this is something that's, this is Brian Paddock. This has come up. I'm not sure who, Jimmy or you, can handle this, but how does TVA consider small modular reactors in a mix of generation when there is currently not a single design for such a reactor prepared or underway?
Well, yeah, let me talk about, and Brian probably knows more about this than I do actually, but in the previous IRP process, they did look at the completion of Watts Bar coming online, and further down the line, the Bellefonte plant. They also included, a few, I don't remember exactly, 15 years in the future, a few Westinghouse 1000 reactors. They're obviously not on the list anymore. The small modular reactor question is sort of open, and I'm hoping that as this IRP process develops, we'll have to keep an eye on how they want to include SMRs in the mix. But if we play this right, we can at least de-emphasize that as a resource.
Yeah, and I think while we're talking about nuclear, there's a couple other nuclear questions here that I think we can kind of handle while we're talking about this. So one is from, I'll just read two of them. I think they're related here. So one of them is Gary Morgan asks, is the TVA considering up to 40% nuclear as part of their generation portfolio? And then another question that has come in from Rick Clemenzi, why does delay of nuclear plants impact resources available for the IRP?
Let me go with the second one first. The IRP lays out a timeline for when new generation facilities are going to come online. They had laid out the Watts Bar 2 plant to come online like now, I think, maybe, or last year actually. So the delay in the Watts Bar plant coming online has a cascading effect down. Since Watts Bar was delayed, Bellefonte was delayed. So a lot of the nuclear generating assets that were included in the 2011 IRP are just not available right now. And in their plan, TVA had assumed they would be available. So, and in addition to that, the delay and cost overrun of the Watts Bar project has led, seems to be, this is my opinion, seems to have led TVA to be a little bit less interested in bringing Bellefonte online. So it's unlikely that Bellefonte is going to be considered a generating asset for the 2015 IRP. So, and then further down the line, whether you're going to have SMRs available in, 2025 or whenever they're planning, that's going to be an issue that'll have to be addressed in the 2015 IRP process. So that's how the scheduling of these things affects what you can expect to have available, what assets and resources you will have available at a given time in your future timeline to plan around. Now, Gary's question, the 40% thing, that's an interesting question. In the last TVA board meeting, they did present what they called, I think, an aspirational goal to be 40% nuclear. That was going to come about by reducing coal and more so than increasing nuclear, though. I'm not sure how that 40% will play into the 2015 planning process. I don't think that number per se will be a factor in the modeling. I think they're going to model the individual nuclear assets in their resource plan and see what comes up. My guess would be that it's probably going to be around 40% coming out of the IRP because if anything, maybe we can encourage them to cut that down in future years, but for the near term, I think that's probably going to be where we're going to end up. But it's again, the 40% is, I don't think that's a number the TVA is shooting for per se. They call it an aspirational goal. I think that just shows up because they've got a fixed nuclear portfolio and the rest of their generating mix is changing around that.
Okay, great. Thanks for those questions. So we still got plenty of questions here, so I will continue. And please feel free to submit, because if we don't get to them, we'll get to them later via email. So here's Paul Messerschmidt has a couple questions. One is, where is load management and demand response considered in the IRP? I'm not sure if we've...
Yeah, that's a good question. It'll be modeled as demand response rather than as a resource, but to tell you the truth, I'm not sure how that's going to show up in the IRP process. That's part of what we're going over now in the planning process. So, you know, I'll definitely keep an eye on that. And if you have any future questions about it, about how it's going, get in touch with me and I'll let you know the latest.
Great. Okay, so let me, there was another question by Paul that we can handle, I think, quickly, which is wheeling through TVA an option on the table?
It's not going to be part of the IRP planning process. This is going to be TVA's plan for their generating resources that they need to meet their demand requirements. The part of that will be outside sales across the TVA border. Wheeling across TVA doesn't have any impact on the IRP process.
Okay, another question here from Brian Brainerd again is, what are the challenges and pinch points for TVA meeting demand?
Interesting how you put that. The biggest challenge TVA is facing is in that regard is the low growth scenario they're looking at right now. I mean, having said that, I realize over the last 2 days TVA had a little bit of an issue meeting demand, but generally what TVA is looking at is lower demand growth than they had projected. So they're closing down coal plants and taking nuclear plants off their future plans. So right now what they're looking at is having actually a surplus of demand rather than worrying about meeting demand. Again, you know, days like the last few days make a liar out of me when I say that, but generally speaking, that's the problem they're addressing is how is their business model going to work in a low or no growth future.
Great. I will say that some of these questions are kind of specific to certain in-service territory areas and distributors. So if we're not handling those questions on this call, it's just because we'll get back to you more directly as those are kind of more specific questions that might not benefit everybody on the call, but don't think we haven't heard you and see your questioning coming in. See, we have a couple more questions coming in. So here's one from Bob Alexander. What is SACE's view of TVA's efforts dealing with distributed generation? Are they, and I'm not sure who they is in this context, but are they seriously supporting facilities such as industrial sites or wastewater facilities to develop their own generation?
Yeah, who's they? TVA has programs in place. Their Renewable Standard Offer program and other programs that those kind of facilities can use to do those kinds of generating projects. SACE's view, we think they're not doing enough. Of course, that's because that's what we do. But TVA has done a pretty good job of encouraging distributed generation. I'm thinking solar and wind right now. Specifically, let's go with solar. They had a program in place with a very generous reward for putting in solar. Then they closed the program down in April, so that didn't work out too well. They reopened it in October. It stayed open for about a second and a half, and I mean that literally. So we think that TVA could do a better job of being more consistent in their efforts to encourage distributed generation. And I'll leave it at there. It's a little general, but if anybody has any more specific questions, feel free.
Okay, so we've had a couple of questions too, specifically about the TVA board members. So just kind of paraphrasing, one question is who are the allies on the TVA board, and another was any thoughts on who will replace TVA board members Stanson and Haskew, whose terms are expiring in early 2014?
On the latter, no, we don't really have any clue who's going to be replacing Stanson and Haskew. As far as who our allies are, well, not knowing who's listening in on this call, I'm going to say they all are.
Yeah, exactly.
They're all our friends. We do actually work fairly closely with all the members of the board, and for the most part, don't have any major problems with anybody there. So, you know, I was kind of being facetious, but I'm going to stick with that they kind of all are our allies on the board.
And I think it's important to note that TVA has created this new FACA to serve as an advisory committee directly to the board, the Regional Energy Resource Council. So I think, you know, that shows from TVA that, you know, they want the board to be as informed as possible from the stakeholders, and so it's given a new outlet for them to, you know, get that input. And as we said before, SACE and SELC have seats on that FACA. So, you know, feel free to reach out to us if you have, you know, more specific questions about the board or want to find out more about how we interact with them through that FACA group. Okay, so we have some more questions here from Tiffany Miller. Are renewable energies going to be supported by TVA even with the projection of lower demand growth?
Well, that's basically the $64,000 question there. So far, we don't see any sign of them backing away from renewable energy or energy efficiency. It's always been a problem to integrate these two resources into their mix. We've been making a lot of progress along those lines. They tend to be, energy efficiency in particular tends to be a low-cost generation option, not a generation option, but a low-cost supply option. So, you know, in my view, it should survive very well in a low-growth scenario. And similarly for renewables, that as the cost drops and they become more competitive, I don't see any reason TVA wouldn't include them in their generation portfolio going forward. That's one of the main issues that we're trying to push TVA on, is to make sure they do continue to fully support renewables and energy efficiency, even in a low growth or no growth future.
Great, thanks for that. I think this is a good question to build off, and I'll note that we've reached the hour here, so we're going to look. We have a lot of questions, so we'll try to get to a couple more, and we have a list of your questions we'll refer back to, and as we've said countless times, feel free to email and follow up if we did not get to your question or answer it adequately. So this one is from Ben Edwards. How is TVA accounting for energy efficiency and its projected fuel mix? In your estimation, are they open to building efficiency improvements as a significant resource?
Yeah, that's so far they've been very open to looking at this. The programs, although they've been well designed, they might not have been implemented as well as possible. There have been budget constraints. You know, the energy efficiency group at TVA did a really good job of laying out energy efficiency programs as and they've done a good job of justifying them as a low-cost part of their generation mix. They ran into some budget constraints that I don't think should have been there. I think, you know, given the fact that they're a low-cost option, it doesn't make any sense to limit the lowest cost option you have. But generally speaking, they do account for them in the fuel mix. And going back to the board, Dr. Marilyn Brown, who is a recently reappointed board member, is definitely a friend of making sure that energy efficiency is counted in the generation mix as a resource and not just as an add-on. So far, so good.
Great. Okay, I think not sure how long we wanted to run over, but I think we have one more question. This one again is from Wolf Nagley. It's a little long. So a big question is how thorough and comprehensive TVA's risk assessments will be with regard to possible impacts on the power system and on the regional economy from climate change, massive disruption of the national cyber infrastructure, or terrorist attacks. So how much attention will TVA give to making the power system more robust, resilient, and flexible for recovery?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The risk assessment, if you'll recall, part of when I described the IRP process, the risk assessment is part of the process, and some of the things you mentioned are included in the risk assessment. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure which are and which aren't. And another thing is in the 2011 IRP, the transmission planning part of it wasn't included, so none of that transmission risk was addressed. Hopefully in the 2015 IRP, the transmission planning process will be included, and that risk assessment is going to be a big part of that. As coal generation facilities have been shut down, the question of the risk of blackouts and brownouts, how well the transmission system can handle the changing load shape and changing supply shape, has become a big issue for TVA, and they've done a lot of work addressing that. In fact, there probably are a few things that have so far not been shut down because TVA is trying to mitigate that transmission risk. So this is a huge issue, and it's one that we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on in the upcoming IRP process.
All right, well, I think with that, we will close our question and answer. I really appreciate everybody paying attention and giving some really good questions here. So I'm going to hand it back to Aaron to kind of close it out, but thank you all for participating.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks, Jimmy, and everybody for attending today and for your thoughtful questions. We hope you'll join us again. This webinar, we have recorded this webinar, and so it will be posted on our website by the end of this week. You will also receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email that we will send to you this week as well. So have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye.